Okay, in this presentation, I just want to answer your questions from the brainstorm and to start to help you move towards legal reasoning. Um, so, kind of like the easiest thing to think about is that, we just started with these student inquiries, right? So, we're just starting scratch from the very beginning. Like, what legal topic are you most interested in? And I just want to show you there was a wide range of ideas, and all of them are acceptable, right? None of them are problematic. So I think, if we thought about it in just terms of injustice versus kind of the ideal of justice, then I'd say like the person who wants to look at criminal justice, you'd be looking at the ideal of justice and injustice, right? So how to kind of keep that balance because that's really what the system is about. Whereas if you're thinking about something like the illegal actions of ICE, that would be looking more at, how has this system gone so wrong? And that's really kind of, the only real difference is just how you kind of form uh, your analysis, right? So I just wanted you to see these are all the kind of different areas. So then, I was asking you to think about like what would be the best way to share this information. And again, each of you had very different ways of even thinking about it. And again, all of them are acceptable. So there's not really one right or wrong answer here. Now, obviously, some of them are easier to do than others. Although, even for the person who put protest, um, you know, certainly you could protest, right? And like film yourself protesting, and that would be okay. However, there are certain consequences to doing that. So I think if you wanted to even just collect videos of protest and then present that information, that would also be one acceptable way of doing it. Same thing with those of you who did like a public forum or listening sessions. You could easily do this over Zoom or over social media. So, there's multiple ways of doing even the harder things that folks have kind of come up with here. So here are some of your questions and answers. Um, so these are pretty typical. So I'm not really going to go through each of them individually because this happens like each semester, no matter what the format really is of the final project. But again, I just wanted to see that people are kind of asking similar questions, right? Like basically, how narrow is the topic? What has to be in the final zine? How are you going to present this information? Is there a specific format? And then, how do you get it to me? All of these kind of things are what I would call like technical details that we can kind of sort out. There isn't one answer because I think, as one person just really said really beautifully, is that they're not really good at drawing, but they're good at writing. And so that person obviously is not going to present or share the information in the same way as somebody else who did drawing. These questions are a little bit broader, so I do want to answer these. Where can we find true information about politics? Now, I emailed this person, but I think this is a good question for everybody. I actually just wrote an article or got an article published about this idea. I think it's best that you bring the information to me and I can help you decide whether it's true or reliable information. I can't tell you that some information is good and some information is bad. Even conspiracy theories can be correct from time to time. And even something that appears to be from a bad source could still be true. And so I wouldn't worry so much about the precise source as much as like developing the skills to be able to tell what's credible information and what's intentionally misleading information. When you want to think about politics, here's what I do. I mostly ignore American news outlets. So I get my information from British, French, Al Jazeera. I mean, even even the Russian media, which you can assume is going to be misleading, but at least it's misleading. But what I'm saying here is that I'd like to get a perspective outside of the country of what people are observing is happening inside our country. And then, to be blunt, I guess, I read books and I read academic articles, and that helps me have a better sense of how to contextualize the information. So if I hear somebody say, well, did you hear? I already have a bunch of background knowledge on that particular subject. But again, best that you just bring it to me and I'll help you figure it out. Again, no, a zine doesn't have to have drawings. In fact, what's interesting about a zine is that it can be whatever you want. It's kind of an underground approach to sharing information. So I can just say what it is not. It is not a PowerPoint presentation, and it is not an academic article, right? So it's like the counter culture or the counter article. So, I think this is interesting, right? Some ideas about improving poverty problems. From my class last semester, we looked at the United Nations Sustainability Goals, which you can just Google, and there's lots of ideas of how to address poverty. I think the two questions you have to think about on this one is, are you trying to change the entire economic, what are called the mode of production, which I would say you should, right? You're not going to solve any poverty problems if you keep with the same industrial capitalist mode of production. It's going to reproduce the same problems over and over again. Or are you thinking about addressing a certain problem and kind of like stop the bleeding approach? So say like homelessness, right? Where you're just trying to help people who are presently homeless, but you're not thinking about whether there'll be future homeless people. I think it just makes it more manageable if you're able to kind of decide, are you looking at the big picture or are you going to look at one specific example? And then certainly you don't want to think about poverty in the global sense. You're going to need to narrow down. So I would suggest looking at poverty just in New York or some other city. Why does the criminal justice system need reformed? I hope that after you reviewed the student voices, that should be obvious to you. However, this is a tough question. I think you should be asking, how does the CRJ system need to be reformed? Not why. I could say something like it doesn't, right? Because I have several students who say abolish it, just get rid of it. So that's one answer. You're probably thinking it's good enough as it is because it probably works for you. So you'd need to see it from other points of view. I think the largest argument that I've heard from people in lawyers and judges is that we have the largest prison population and we have one of the smallest actual populations. So that's a problem. It's a problem because either we have like the most evil people in the world, which is really hard to imagine. And then secondly, it's exceedingly expensive. And that causes even more problems for society, for re-entry, separating families. I mean, all these things that you hear about with just a basic research, which, to be blunt, you should have learned in POL 63, Intro to Criminal Justice. But, again, I think maybe if you said, how does the CRJ system need to be reformed, you could get a little bit more specific, right? Because the entire system involves courts, cops, corrections, victim services, the legal system. And by legal system, I mean legal education, right? The judicial politics. It also involves education, healthcare, right? I mean, there's just too many things to even, solve at once. What is the premise of discussion when it comes to Second Amendment? I'm hoping that this is the student I had a conversation with, but I would say, you should start with the words of the Second Amendment. And start to think about how those could be interpreted. I don't know, maybe start with 3 different ways. Probably more than, there's probably more than that, but start with 3. Like I said, so law is an ideal, right? So let's say everybody could be in a militia. So what would that look like? And then what would the Second Amendment mean in that sense, right? Would everybody get a nuclear device, which actually might not be a bad idea? Or would everybody restrict it to like a knife? And then I think the second part was, what's the lived experience? So how do you account for kids with guns who go and shoot other kids at schools, people who shoot people at movie theaters, people like the KKK that hunt people down and kill people, people who are on meth. And, so you see all the different dilemmas of the injustice. How do you see it from the victim's point of view and society at large that has to deal with this? And then finally, if you're the judge, how would you look at trying to figure out how to address those two extremes. And then why is the criminal justice system so unfair? I would say, this word exegesis or interpretation, how people interpret constitutional rights, values, society, all of these kind of different things, that's going to determine fairness, right? So what is fair to one person might not be fair to another person. And so I'd say probably why the system itself, right, as a large thing is so unfair is that society is unfair, or we are unfair, right? That we don't actually even really strive for fairness. If you think about it, I think, I don't know if you've been told the same thing I've been told, but over and over again, people have told me life's not fair. Life isn't a thing, so of course it doesn't really matter. But we are not treating people fairly. I don't know why we'd expect cops and judges to do so either. So just to close up here, your research is going to be guided by your inquiry, which means each of your research is going to be different, although a few of you are looking at the same concept. So you all could work together, or I could share that information. After you review the legal language video lecture, you're going to complete a legal inquiry question and thesis assignment. This will kind of tell me how you're doing so far, and whether you're able to apply what you're learning and do it in real life, and not just, repeat the information. And I'd like you to think of the zine as the final product, right? So imagine you were making a film and the genre is horror science fiction. You'd want to think about, how do you decide what the final product will actually look like, right? That's going to be your decision, right? Like, those are the choices that you can make. All I've kind of given you is that it has to be legal research. I've given you some resources and some ways of thinking about it, and I'm going to grade you on how you apply that. But what you decide to present it as is entirely your choice. So I think you should use your skill set. If you're good at writing, you should do, a written document. If you're good at the digital graphic, like an infographic, then you should do that. If you must do a PowerPoint, because I don't think that's quite what I had in mind, but you could do just like 3 slides or less. The point here is that a zine is right to the a target audience, right? And so a 10-slide PowerPoint is not something that people, ordinary folks, would want to kind of, view. You could do a video recording, survey with responses, newsletter, paper brochure, a flyer, a cartoon, a song, or anything else, right? Anything you can kind of think of. And you can always submit a draft or idea to me over email before you get started, and tell me this is kind of what you're doing. I'm going to ask for a draft later on, but you can always check in with me. So that leads me to kind of like the last slides, which is revisions and applying legal knowledge. So basically just, put this all together. You started with a legal concept that was pretty naive. Let's be honest, right? This was before you came to class. So this was an unchallenged and unreflective point of view, which is something you had been thinking about. You might have picked up some ideas in some other classes, but now I'm providing a legal angle to you. You've now read 4 to 5 legal materials, so you have much more of a frame of how you can have different narratives about legal ideology, legal institutions, and legal instrumentalities. And I'll explain more of that, but I do have some video lectures if you're curious and want to get ahead on YouTube that goes into much more detail on those ideas. You've now selected a concept and you have to apply the legal knowledge in this zine format. So over the next few weeks, you're going to learn, 1, the legal language, and then the legal context and usage, how to measure change in that sense. This is going to lead to this kind of final thing. So it's like legal language, legal usage, and how to measure legal change will lead to what's called legal reasoning or abduction. And then finally, your revised zine, the final draft, and your presentation will be graded by how well you've applied these 4 legal concepts. So this means you and I will see evidence that your naive point of view is now more coordinated. In other words, you're able to apply different ways of looking at this through the law, and you've been able to use legal language in the legal context. And again, you're going to do this in pieces so that I can kind of help you as you go along, and you won't have to worry so much about doing everything at once. And this is all we're doing in this class from here on out. So this will be hopefully a guided way of doing this.